Welcome to share your screen, Don, whenever you're ready.
Okay, well, hello everybody. Hope your summer is going as well as can be expected. Um,
Hi, guys.
Today we're going to be talking about the whole idea of tribal nonprofit and how it might be beneficial to you in a campaign mode. And I'll try to share that information with you, not only from the standpoint of the technical steps you would need to take, but also how it works from a more practical standpoint. So let me go ahead and pull that up. There's the thanks to IMLS and NAI for their support. And we're putting our focus on a tribally chartered nonprofit, but I want to start today by talking about nonprofits in more general terms. And then we'll start focusing in on uh, what a tribal not-for-profit might look like. And I think it's important, I think many of you know, but it's important to recognize that nonprofit organizations are corporations chartered by some government entity. And so they're not an association or sort of a group of people, good-hearted people trying to do good things. They are, in fact, a legal entity, a legal business entity. And typically they're a nonprofit corporation. Um, there are over 1 million not-for-profits in the United States. And we're seeing more and more not-for-profits being established. I do a study of nonprofit development in my state in Washington, and in 1 month in Washington, there were almost 250 new not-for-profits established. So it's a growing population of these nonprofit organizations, all of which are coming together for some good purpose. These are people typically who have met together for a period of time and then made the decision that they wanted to formalize their relationship by becoming a nonprofit corporation. So when you do that, let's say that one of you decides, yeah, I'd like to go forward with a nonprofit. You as a natural person are separate and distinct from this legal person that you've created, right? This nonprofit organization takes on its own legal status. And sometimes it's hard to keep those things separate. Well, my not-for-profit, or I'm the chairman, so we speaking personally as well as for the organization, and that can get people into trouble sometimes. So, just want to make sure you're aware that we're talking about a legally established corporation, and we're talking about a separate and distinct legal entity. And some of the ways that you might take into consideration when it comes to how nonprofits are similar to for-profits. The bottom line is a for-profit can do virtually anything. I'm sorry, a not-for-profit can do virtually anything a for-profit can do. And yet you hear people say things like, "Oh, we're just a not-for-profit. We can't do that." And that's simply not the case. Not-for-profits, for example, can purchase needed goods and services. You can go out on behalf of the not-for-profit and buy the supplies or the equipment that you need to carry out your mission. You can have paid staff. That includes salaries and wages, benefits and bonuses. So you can you can have a rigorous personnel section if you like. You can own and sell property. For tribal organizations, that can be a pretty important piece when you're talking about the ability to own and sell property. They can actually issue bonds. That's one thing people don't realize. You can issue a nonprofit bond, and if there are people interested in buying that bond, you can generate capital that way. And of course, you can enter into mergers and acquisitions. And I can think of an organization in the Seattle area that ultimately made the decision, yeah, we're going to merge with another not-for-profit so we can strengthen our ability to deal with or to help people who are deaf or hard of hearing. What else can you do as a not-for-profit? What other business activities can you be engaged in? Well, virtually anything else you can think of. So when you think about the nonprofit thrift shop, for example, that's a business, right? That's a business that they've taken on to generate revenue. And so earned income is becoming increasingly important as a way of supporting your not-for-profit. What museum have you been to that doesn't have a museum shop, right? Where you can buy items from that museum shop. That's a nonprofit business engaged in earned income. And what is the major difference between not-for-profits and for-profits? The major difference is the not-for-profit corporation cannot distribute excess revenue to their boards and members for no reason. Okay? And the example I like to give is one where the nonprofit has $20,000 left in the bank account at the end of the year, and there are 5 board members. So, okay, well, we'll just pass out, uh, pass out uh, our share of that $20,000 to each of our 5 board members, say $4,000 each. 2 problems with that. Number one, not-for-profit board members aren't paid. They don't get paid for their service. They are volunteers. And second, you can't simply pass out nonprofit resources for no apparent reason. Contrast that with a situation where the nonprofit has that surplus of revenue, and I've told the executive director, if you raise $100,000 in donations this year, we'll give you a $5,000 bonus. That is okay. That would be okay for the board to do because they've set a standard by which they would pass out some of that excess revenue to, in that case, a staff member. So the major point here is that there's a tendency to think of nonprofits as, oh, we're a nonprofit. We can't make any money. We can't pay any salaries. Lots of things we cannot do. And that's simply not true. The only thing you can't do is pass out excess revenue. The other distinction we want to make, just getting started, is what's the difference between a public charity and a private foundation? Well, you might be aware of private foundations like the Bush Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Kellogg Foundation. Each of those typically has funding from one primary source. In the case of the Ford Foundation, it was a gift from the estate of Henry Ford that decided, to establish that foundation. And a private foundation must donate 5% of its assets every year to other charitable groups. So that's a private foundation. A public charity, which is typical for most not-for-profits, it enjoys a broader funding base. And it carries out charitable programs, so it's characterized as a public charity. It's looked at as a public charity. If you're looking at, what are your options? Well, to be candid, you can look at a number of options that might be of interest to you. One of those is a thing called Section 7871. And oftentimes when I talk about non-for-profits for tribes, the response is, well, we don't need a not-for-profit. We have the ability to receive charitable giving and grants through our status as a 7871 organization. And many of you may already be aware of that, but just to briefly review, 7871 of the Internal Revenue Code says that tribes are treated like any other government. And so an individual could make a charitable gift to the tribe and receive a tax deduction for having made that gift. So, no problem. It's true. If I wanted to write a check to the state of Washington for $100, I might be able to consider that to be a charitable gift to the state of Washington, just like if I made a gift to the Squaxin Island tribe. So yeah, that's one strategy. Another strategy is a tribally chartered corporation. And that's really important to me because, as we'll learn later on, tribally chartered corporations respect and reflect sovereignty. And like I say, we'll talk about that a bit more down the road. Is it possible for a tribal organization to be incorporated by the state government? And it's not like it's that uncommon. Some people have made the decision that that's just easier, they're more comfortable going to the state, and so they asked the state to incorporate their nonprofit corporation. Another option that's available, it's less used than it has been in the past. It's also possible to incorporate your nonprofit organization in the District of Columbia, and using their municipal code as a way to generate a nonprofit corporation. So those are choices that you have when you're thinking about, do you want to think about establishing that corporation for a tribal organization? And so, yeah, tribally chartered might be a way to go. IRS approved. We'll talk about that a little bit more as well, but the process is 2 steps. You have to establish your nonprofit corporation, and you have to be IRS approved to be able to receive a tax deduction, or to offer a tax deduction as a tax exempt and nonprofit organization. And then this idea of serving as a portal for tribal projects and encouraging private sector contributions. We'll reemphasize that again a little bit down the road, but that's a really important concept, because what's happening is you can have dollars coming through your not-for-profit for the same project that dollars are coming from the tribe. And you can blend those dollars together to build your cultural center or build the museum or whatever it might be. And that's okay with private sector donors. They understand that dynamic. So the examples I can offer for you are the Port Gamble Scalalum Foundation, the Tulalip Foundation, the Suquamish Foundation, and the Colville Foundation. And those are 4 tribally chartered foundations that Sparrowhawk has helped form over the years, all part and parcel of looking forward to developing a campaign on behalf of that particular tribe. Now, in the case, just looking at these as kind of case studies, in the case of the Port Gamble Scalalum Foundation, there was actually a foundation established in the 1980s, but it hadn't been active at all. There really hadn't been any activity at all, and so we ended up converting it from the Scalalum Foundation to the Port Gamble Scalalum Foundation to help with raising the money for the $5 million campaign for the Longhouse, the Elder Center, the Education Center, and the library. And we talked about those campaigns, so I won't spend time on that today. But that foundation became a really important partner with the tribe when it came to bringing receipts, bringing donations from particularly private sector and individual donors. So a very useful approach. And we'll see down the road that the Port Gamble Scalalum Foundation continues to be an active arm of the tribe when it comes to acquiring other property, managing other property. As a not-for-profit, it's been a very active and probably one of the most prominent foundations that we've helped create. The same thing holds true with the Suquamish Foundation. Now, one of the concerns that tribal leaders will have about a foundation is the loss of control. And so in the case of the Suquamish Foundation, we established the board of directors in a way that made sure that the tribe retained control of the foundation. But at the same time, a number of the members from the community were recruited to join the foundation board to broaden the reach of the appeal that the foundation could make on behalf of that $19 million campaign. So you had individuals with strong connections to funders in the Seattle area who were invited and encouraged to come to the board and be a part of that board, along with tribal members, tribal elders, members of the tribal council, who made up that 15-member board of directors. And I think I mentioned during a previous webinar that in one instance, that non-tribal member of the foundation board basically increased the Seattle-based funder from their initial gift of $10,000. She helped them add $150,000 more to their giving toward that $19 million campaign. So these are examples of tribal foundations that you'll want to take into consideration as you go through the process of analyzing, yeah, do we want to go this route or not? So tribal not-for-profits create this additional way of securing gifts and grants. And some funders require that you have what we call 501c3 status, which is nonprofit and tax deductible or tax exempt. And tribally chartered not-for-profits help support the idea of sovereignty and self-determination. And to me, that's a really important piece. It's really important to take those kinds of things into consideration, because sovereignty is exactly that. It's the highest level of respect for the tribe as a nation. So if you ask yourself, yeah, do we want to do this? Kind of the short way of answering it. Yes, you'll want to go ahead with a foundation or a tribal not-for-profit because it adds additional focus to resource development. It gives extra emphasis on the idea of the tribe developing additional resources for buildings or for projects. It'll make some tribal projects eligible where the funder wouldn't otherwise fund that project. So that's important. As I mentioned, it's the opportunity to add more people to your project and to your campaign. And I think that's an important piece of it. It's also a way to overcome resistance to giving to the tribe. Because what are we going to hear from funders? Well, hey, the tribes, the foundation, the casinos, other enterprise activities are coming back online. You're going to start receiving dollars from those organizations. Really should we go forward with giving dollars to your foundation? And there we talk about it as a partnership, where yeah, the tribe is putting in some dollars, and the tribe's foundation is putting in dollars based on charitable giving from both individuals and other private sector. The no part is, yeah, there's going to be some additional staff time in developing the agenda, working with the board. We call it kind of the care and feeding of these board members and others who are part of the foundation. And how is that typically handled? At least in our experience, the tribe assigns on a part-time basis someone to take responsibility as the initial executive director. And that can work out pretty well. It's obvious that you're going to have to establish the charter, the articles of incorporation, the bylaws, all the forms that are required to carry out the development of this foundation. There's going to be separate accounting. You have to keep your foundation from those of the tribe. But as we'll learn a little bit later on, it's possible for the foundation as a separate legal entity to have a contract with the tribe to have the tribe do its accounting and do so with separate accounts. So when a grant comes in to help build the cultural center, it goes into the cultural center building fund as a separate and distinct account. And like I say, the tribe, by virtue of a contract between the foundation and the tribe, could take that on. We call that a quid pro quo contract, because in that instance, the tribe is getting some benefit from the foundation, and the foundation is getting benefit from the tribe. And the last, of course, is the required foundation to set up and submit reports. And that could be either to the tribe on an annual basis. It could also include a report to the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, based on your tax exempt status. Good news is, though, that most times those reports are pretty simple. We just helped file one for one of our clients. It was a postcard. It was a postcard filing. So not a big deal when it comes to the reports, at least in most instances. And then how do you create one of these things? What are the specific steps that you need to take to create these organizations? Typically, if you're going through the tribal process, the tribal council will either charter the organization according to its business code or its constitution. And in the case of the Colville Foundation, that organization was created under the Colville Confederated Tribes Business Code. At the time the Suquamish Foundation was created, they didn't have a business code. And so they used Article 3 of their Constitution as a basis by which they would create the Suquamish Foundation. Now, the charter includes key information, the name of the organization, and that's important. We'll get back to that in a minute. The duration. Typically, the duration of these not-for-profits is perpetual. Okay, it's perpetual. The purpose of the not-for-profit, who is on the initial board, who might be the officers, how do you, or what provisions do you have for officers, and how do you constitute membership if you're going to have a membership not-for-profit. Of course, a provision for dissolution of the organization if you decide to dissolve it, and any provisions for amendments of the charter or the articles of incorporation. Just real briefly, you go back to the name. Some organizations, some states, for example, limit the name you can use for your foundation. In Washington, you can't call it, the XYZ Foundation Incorporated. It has to have a name that reflects its nonprofit status. Whereas in New York, you can use incorporated, like Red Cross Incorporated. The purpose statement is also really important because it tells the people who are reading about the foundation what is your legal purpose. And there we recommend that you can have a very specific purpose statement, but that you also have language in your purpose statement that gives you the ability to do any other thing lawful pursuant to the code under which you're applying. So your tribal business code, for example, might give you the ability to do a lot of different things, and you'll want to have that broader purpose to allow you a little more flexibility down the road. Who your initial board members are, that depends a lot on where you're going to apply to become a foundation or a nonprofit. Just by way of example, in Washington, it only requires a single person, a single natural person, to be on the initial board. It makes the board meetings kind of weird, so we don't recommend that you go with a single member board member, but legally, at least in some cases, that is legal to do. Who do you want for officers, and will you have a membership or not? There are two different kinds of not-for-profits. One is a membership-based, where the members get together on an annual basis and they elect the board of directors. And typically there's a quorum requirement. 10% of the membership has to be present at that annual meeting to conduct business, for example. The other type of not-for-profit is a board-based not-for-profit. In that case, the board, if there's a vacancy on the board, the board takes responsibility for filling those vacancies, and there is no membership vote for the board of directors. Dissolution and amendments are pretty straightforward. The only thing to think about when it comes to dissolution is typically the law you're working with requires you to identify either a specific organization that will receive your assets if you dissolve, or at least provisions that says that the board will make that determination when you choose to dissolve the organization. So those are the things that you want to take a look at. Now, there's a sample charter in the materials that I sent to you through Melissa, and that's the Suquamish Charter. So you'll be able to see this in much greater detail if you're interested in looking at the Suquamish Charter. I can bring it up. I don't know if people have interest in looking at it in more detail or not, but you do have a copy of it there in your handouts. The bylaws are designed to provide sort of the rules of the road. And what I'm seeing more and more in modern drafting is the desire to put more of the information in the bylaws and less in the charter or the articles of incorporation. And the reason that's true is because typically to change the charter or to change the articles of incorporation, you have to go back to the governing body and ask them, or at least file with them amended articles of incorporation. Whereas the bylaws are typically uh, rules you can change by board action without having to go back to the governing body. So, for example, you could say something like, there shall be a board of directors composed of no less than 5 members and no more than 15 members. And provisions regarding the additional provisions regarding the board of directors shall be found in the bylaws. Gives you the opportunity then to put more detailed information about the board, how it's run, what a quorum is, all that sort of thing can be in the bylaws that you can change whenever you choose. And again, without going back to the governing body. So it's probably hard to see, but here you've got basically the front page of the, so I can make it a little bit larger here. There you go. These are the components of the Squamish charter, right? So you've got the name, the duration, the purpose, the powers, the board, limited liability, sovereign immunity, of course, has been added based on it being a tribal entity, and distribution of assets. It basically is the dissolution that I talked about. A registered agent is also an important piece. The registered agent is the one who receives service of process should the foundation or the not-for-profit be sued. So you have that as a single point of contact. It's also typically the one who receives your mail and other bank statements, that kind of thing. So that's just an example of the components, the 19 components that the Squamish developed. And again, you've got the full, you've got all the language in your handouts. Okay. So we have some questions here, and we got to catch up some questions. And I'm also going to make it bigger. There you go. Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, Matt indicates that the Pawnee Nation is a 7871 entity. That's basically tied to its link to the tribe or to the nation itself. So that's, you can basically draw on that. Do not-for-profits have to pay unrelated business income taxes on revenue from retail income and other revenues not related to their mission? Yeah, and that's an important consideration, especially when you're starting to take on the development of this foundation, because the purpose statement and your mission become the litmus test by which you can decide whether or not you have to pay unrelated business income. So let's say that this not-for-profit has a hamburger stand, right? They're selling burgers and fries. And I had a client that had that exact situation. He paid a 2% excise tax on that burger stand because it really didn't have anything to do with his mission or with his purpose statement. But if that organization was a youth employment training program, then there wouldn't be any tax. There wouldn't be any unrelated business income tax, because the young people that are served by that nonprofit would be engaged in a business activity that was related to youth employment training, and therefore there wouldn't be any tax. So that's an important thing to take into consideration. That's why we like to have people use as specific language that talks about their specific purposes, but also some broadening language toward the end of that section that gives them the ability to carry out any lawful activity. That makes it a little bit easier that way. And then the tribal foundations I'm talking about are considered public charities, and not private foundations. Now, when it comes to that, a public charity can still make grants. So it gets a little confusing because a group like the Ford Foundation or Kellogg is pretty much exclusively established for making out grants to other not-for-profit organizations, whereas your tribal foundation might have responsibility for raising money, that is bringing resources, revenue in to help build the cultural center, but it doesn't preclude them from making a grant or a gift to another nonprofit. So that's you can have both purposes within your tribal foundation. And then, yeah, another good point that Susan brought up is it's possible to have what I would call a hybrid organization where you can have members who are dues paying members, but they're non-voting members. And that's considered a kind of a hybrid. They don't meet on an annual basis. They don't elect the board of directors, but they are legitimately members of the foundation or the not-for-profit. And that can work okay. You have to decide from within your own community, what model makes the most sense. Some organizations are adamant about making it a membership organization where tribal members are, they're in the driver's seat. They elect the board on an annual basis. The question, can the tribe decide to take over a tribal nonprofit for their own purpose or because they don't like something the not-for-profit is doing? Okay, yeah, and there you're talking about the issue of control. To what degree does the tribe have control over the not-for-profit? There's two parts to the answer there. One is that the tribal control issue is why some tribal organizations choose to be incorporated not by the tribe, but by the state in which they operate to give them some buffer. So that's frankly why you would not use a tribal charter. But I think it's really important whenever possible to do exactly that, to have the nonprofit chartered by the tribe. The other part, though, is that it can create some safeguards. So, for example, with the Suquamish Foundation, even in the course of a five-year, $19 million campaign, the tribe never stepped in and tried to assert its control over the foundation because the majority of the board members were tribal council members or their elders that would basically have control at the foundation level. But the conversations that I remember facilitating where non-tribal members or tribal members who are not council members, those conversations at the board were very productive and sometimes would move the tribe to a different point of view. So there's a lot of nuance here. But I guess the point is that, yeah, that if the tribe establishes it, the tribe does have ultimate control of it. But if you create some safeguards within the articles and bylaws, the tribe would only come on and use that control in kind of an extreme situations. The day-to-day, month-to-month elements, the foundation would operate without that kind of involvement. Okay, yeah, and question: does the tribe really need a separate not-for-profit from the cultural center, or do you need to have both? I can think of the Squaxin Island Museum. They spun off a not-for-profit and established a separate and distinct board, but they don't have a tribal foundation which is separate and distinct from the museum board. Now, the executive director of the tribe is on the tribal museum board, but I guess part of the answer is there a benefit, is there an advantage in having a separate foundation from the cultural center board. You know, are there projects or buildings or activities where a tribal foundation would give you an added benefit? And so in essence, you'd have two not-for-profit organizations supporting the tribe's activities, one focused on the museum or cultural center, and one focused on other tribal projects and activities. And then the question, can a tribal college, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, charter their own not-for-profits? Typically, no. The answer would be no, because the not-for-profit organization wouldn't have a governing authority to create a non-for-profit. That would not be within their powers. Typically, it would have to be a governing body that has that authority. So we've started talking about some of these things, and thanks for those questions. I really appreciate that. Now, all nonprofits are led by a board of directors or board of trustees, and we've started talking about that. But you want to be really careful. We talked a little bit about this in a previous webinar. How do you go out and recruit? How do you identify people that will carry out the work of the not-for-profit organization? Because the board is ultimately responsible for the not-for-profit, right? If you have staff and the staff decide to walk away and do something different, it's the board that's left holding the bag when it comes to this not-for-profit. They're the ones that would have to identify additional staff. They're the ones who would have to kind of keep it going, because legally they're ultimately responsible. And there are legal obligations of a board, right? They have duties of loyalty, care, and obedience. Each of these are legal duties that are commonly found and that would be adopted in most settings. So loyalty, the duty of loyalty is the idea that you're going to be faithful and give undivided allegiance, kind of this legal language. And the loyalty also says the information that you got by being a board member can't be used for your personal gain. You have to do what's in the best interest of the not-for-profit. The duty of obedience says that you will follow the mission of the organization, and you will make sure that you are going to follow the decision, or even if you were on the majority of that decision, you'll go forward and continue to move forward with the mission and goal of the organization. And last, of course, is the duty of care. There, the board members are responsible for carrying out their activities as a board, like any other prudent person would, just taking care to make sure that the organization is being watched over and cared for in a reasonable way. It's basically being a good steward of the organization. And these are the responsibilities of a board: developing and determining the mission and purpose. That's one of the most important roles the board can take on, because as we learned previously, people are going to look at that mission and make a decision about, is this a legitimate activity for this not-for-profit to engage in? If you have the ability to select an executive, that's part of the board's responsibility. Like I say, oftentimes with tribal not-for-profits, it's not unusual to have a member of the tribal staff be detailed as an executive director of the foundation until it gets up and running. Another, of course, important role for the board is financial oversight, making sure there's an annual budget, making sure that there are controls, financial controls in place. Adequate resources. The board has a role with the staff to be sure that the not-for-profit has the resources that are needed to carry out the work of the foundation or the not-for-profit. Of course, ensuring legal and ethical integrity, maintaining accountability. That's typically done through the conflict of interest policy and other policies that the board might develop. Effective organizational planning. We talked a lot about that in a previous webinar, but this is kind of how it falls into the nonprofit board's responsibility, is engaging in the overall, what we call strategic planning, and making sure that the goals of the plan are being moved forward effectively. Other kinds of roles might include recruiting and orienting new board members. And I put an emphasis under orienting new board members. I've been on a number of boards where you got thrown into the board, nobody oriented me. And okay, this is your first board meeting. We're going to vote on some key issues. It makes it very uncomfortable for new board members who don't really have an effective orientation. Enhancing the organization's public standing, also important, because board members are ambassadors. They're meant to be ambassadors for the not-for-profit. And of course, then looking at the programs, making sure and monitoring those programs and services, making sure that they're doing, they're carrying out, the programs are being carried out in a way that's consistent with the mission, and then supporting the executive and assessing his or her performance is kind of the 10th role. I would add one more, and that would be a kind of an 11th role, which is to assess their own performance on an annual basis. That's also an important role for the board. Of course, the responsibilities include things like attending meetings, special events, being informed as a board member, reviewing the agenda and supporting documents before participating in the board meetings and committee meetings, and serving on committees and task forces, being willing to take on special assignments, making a personal financial contribution to the organization. That's the one that always gets us hung up. What? You want to ask me to join this board, but you also want me to make a personal financial contribution to the organization? And of course, the answer is, yeah, we'd like each board member to make a contribution at a level that's comfortable for them. So it doesn't mean that everybody has to put in a whole bunch of money. It means that they're making a gift to the organization on a regular basis that's consistent with their ability to make that gift. And then informing others about the organization as a board member, again, that ambassadorial role. That's really important, that board members go out into the community, talk about the foundation, encourage others to get involved and to volunteer. And so, yeah, going out and identifying nominees, trying to keep up to date, and then following that conflict of interest policies. That's part of the ethical responsibility that board members have. This one is refrain from making special requests of the staff. Well, if you're fortunate enough to have staff, you don't want board members asking the staff to wash their car, for example. So that's a kind of a silly example, but you'd be surprised sometimes people, hey, I'm on the board. Can you do this for me? Can you do that for me? You need to make sure that the board maintains its integrity when it comes to using the staff resource. And then assisting the board in carrying out its fiduciary responsibilities. That includes a regular review of the budget, how much money has been spent, has the money been spent within the budget, what's the budgeted amount versus the actual expenditures. It's not the board making choices about, to buy yellow pencils or green pencils. That's more day to day, but it is reviewing the financial statements in a way that says, yeah, we're on track with our budget and with our actual expenditures. And what's the legal exposure of a board member, right? Because sometimes you'll hear people say, hey, I'd like to serve on your board, but I don't want to get stuck with any kind of legal responsibility. The reality is that typically in your articles and bylaws, you're going to set up indemnification. You're going to protect your board members from being personally responsible for anything that they're doing as a member of the board. In Washington State, boards, for example, are protected from liability for anything other than willful or grossly negligent behavior. So not a big deal there. And most not-for-profits buy insurance. That's called directors' errors and omissions insurance, another way to provide protection. But the reason that you have a corporation in the first place is to help protect the individual assets of the board and the staff. So if you're acting in good faith on behalf of the corporation, you have that kind of protection. Now, as we've been talking, not all not-for-profits are tax exempt. You have to go through the process of applying to become tax exempt from the IRS, right? You can have a tribally chartered not-for-profit and take those articles and bylaws from the tribally chartered not-for-profit and apply for tax exempt status. And like I say, each of the ones you saw in the examples, Colville, Tulielp, et cetera, all went through that process. They were either chartered or they're through their business code, they were created as a corporation, and then the IRS approved them to be tax exempt. And I don't want to suggest that it's always an easy process. For example, with one group, with the Colville Foundation, we submitted articles and bylaws that the tribe had approved when it created the Colville Foundation. We sent those to the IRS, and the IRS came back and said, you better check with the Secretary of State of Washington about those bylaws. We think there's some things you need to fix up based on the Washington state law. And when I called her and said, do you realize this is a tribally chartered foundation? She went, oh, I'm sorry. I made that mistake. I thought it was a Washington based, but yeah, under the tribe, yeah, your bylaws are just fine under the tribal code. Never mind. I think she kind of felt embarrassed that she had missed the fact that it was a tribally chartered foundation, not chartered by the state of Washington. One of the things to keep in mind is that if you do go to tax exempt status, you cannot engage in substantial lobbying or any other advocacy activities. So that's something you'll definitely want to take into consideration. The general rule of thumb is if you spend more than 20% of your resources engaged in lobbying or other kinds of advocacy, that might be considered substantial. And so you don't want to get caught with that. And unfortunately, what is a substantial amount of partisan political activities can the definition of that can vary based on who's in the administration. I'll leave it at that. And then you must also show a charitable purpose, and that's scientific, educational, cultural, religious, lots of different ways to create a charitable purpose. That's not typically been a big deal when it comes to creating or asking for this status. So, yep, you're going to be asking for tax exempt status under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. To apply, you have to be in good standing with the entity that established it. So if you're in good standing with your tribe, if it's a tribally chartered organization, that should be good enough. You'll want to submit your articles and bylaws as part of your application. You also use a thing called a Form 1023 or Form 1023EZ to apply. So that form, one of those forms, plus your articles and bylaws, plus a couple of other minor elements are what makes up your application. And I recommend that you consider doing the 1023EZ. And that's because you can use the EZ form if you don't anticipate any more than $25,000 of revenue in the first year of operation. Well, the reality is, it's say you use the EZ, you create your tax exempt nonprofit organization, and you raise more than 25,000. No one's going to check to see if you raise more than 25,000. So it allows you to use a much shorter form, and the response time is also quite a bit shorter. I've had clients that use the long form, and it was a 3-year process. I've used the EZ form and got the nonprofit and tax exempt status in about 4 months, that's my very fastest time frame. So it is possible to expedite, but I think you'll find it's better to use the EZ. And this is an example of the EZ form for a recent client. I'm trying to make that a little bit bigger as well. But you can see it's basically just a federal form that you fill out, providing a lot of information. about the organization, who's going to be on your initial board of directors, the corporation, what your legal status is. All of these things are part of this relatively short form that you can use to, again, after you have tax exempt, after you have the non-for-profit status, that's the time for you to think about applying for tax exempt status. Let's check for questions. Okay, so yeah, we got a good question about a library, claiming the library or asking the library become a non-for-profit. And the steps that we followed today, we talked about today, there's some work to be done. There's no question about that. But I think it is possible that the library could be a separate and distinct not-for-profit. Like I say, the Squaxin Island Tribes Museum Library Research Center is a separate tribally chartered nonprofit organization with its own board, its own executive director. I will say that the executive director is also on the tribal council and is running for tribal chair at this point. So there's always the possibility for crossover. And in terms of the accounting piece of it, like I say, once the nonprofit is established, you can go to the tribe and ask for an agreement between the not-for-profit and the tribe, in which the tribe's accounting department would take on responsibility for accounting for donations, grants, what have you, that were made to that library, to that new library, a foundation or a not-for-profit. Now another question regarding taxation and tribes taxable by the IRS if on sovereign land. I think the answer there typically is no. They would not be. I can think of the Thurston County Chehalis case where the land was placed in trust. That is, their Great Wolf Lodge enterprise was placed on trust status based on a promise never to have gambling at the Great Wolf Lodge. They converted that land to trust land in 6 months, which was rocket speed for the Bureau. The county sued, trying to get some tax revenue from the tribe, and they lost. They ultimately lost their case. That land became non-taxable based on its trust status. That's a whole nother webinar, I think. Okay, so that's the main of it for today. I'd like to spend as much time as we have on questions. I know that'll get to the focus, help me focus if you're interested in. Okay, so the follow-up question here. So 501c3 is really allowed acquisition of grants from other funders. Yeah, and the answer, yeah, that's a really important characteristic because I'll just fall back on the example I gave you with the Suquamish Foundation. The Suquamish Foundation's campaign was $19 million. The tribe put in 12. The non-tribal funds totaled $7 million. Okay. Of that $7 million, the Gates Foundation put in 850,000. The Norcliffe Foundation put in 160,000. The state of Washington, $1 million through an appropriation to the tribe. But those Norcliffe gifts and the Gates gifts were made not to the tribe, but to their foundation. Individuals made gifts. The Town and Country Market Board of Directors gave $50,000 to the foundation. The chairman and the owner of that company gave $10,000 individually to the foundation. So a large portion of that $7 million went to the foundation, not to the tribe. A portion did, but what I'm saying is of the non-tribal funds, a lot of those dollars went to their foundation, their 501c3. Other questions you might have?
Hey Don, do you want to switch it to where we're all on video? Stop sharing the PowerPoint.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, what questions do we have for Don? That was a great presentation, very informative.
I had a question. How much does it cost to file with the IRS and any other expenses that might be involved?
Right. Thank you for that. Yeah. The cost of filing for the nonprofit status is not expensive. Maybe in the case of the state of Washington, it's $30 to file. So that's not a big expense. To file with the IRS, however, can be upwards of $750, $800. To get that tax exempt status, they've increased that user fee exponentially. So it can be as low as $250, but typically it can be as high as $700, $800 for that. In terms of the cost of actually doing this, not to make a commercial out of it, but we offer this. If you went to an attorney, for example, they've quoted $3,800 to have them do this. The cost that we've charged our clients is substantially less than that, because we make collaboration with the client, and some of the work can be done back and forth, not just do it and hand it over to the client. I think that's not the best way anyhow. I think it's important that it be a collaborative process. But it's not as if you can't do it yourself. One of the things I can put in, there is a thing at kcba.org, and I should have mentioned that at the outset. KCBA, it might be odd for you to think about. This is the King County Bar Association, but at that King County Bar Association website, in their resources section, they have a thing called how to establish a nonprofit organization in Washington. Well, you're not all in Washington, obviously. I don't think except the one group from Port Gamble is not in Washington. But the point is, this 250-page PDF book gives you lots and lots and lots and lots of step-by-step ways to establish a nonprofit organization, and includes some sample articles and bylaws. So, if you wanted to do it for yourself or DIY it, you could go to that site, pull down that 250-page. As a matter of fact, I can send it to Melissa, and you can just distribute it out directly. Again, it's based on Washington, but it's got enough information there that would be useful in any state, and it could be used in a tribal setting, depending on what your business code says. You'll want to make sure, and one of the things that I learned is sometimes the tribal secretary is identified as the Secretary of State of the tribe. And at least at Colville, the Secretary of the tribe was not aware that that was her responsibility. It was news to her that you filed your articles and bylaws with her for review. So we had to spend some time educating her about the business code and what the business code requirements were. But it worked out well because she appreciated the chance to learn more about it. And of course, part of our job with the Strengthening Communities Fund grant program that we had was to help us several tribal not-for-profits as a part of that federal grant program. So waking up that process was really an important process.
Good afternoon. My name is Lillian Chavez.
Hi,
I'm
Lillian.
from Mescalero Apache tribe. As far as the nonprofit, I was trying to recollect, and I think it's just one 501c under the tribe. I don't think it's specifically the library. Is that possible, or do you have any insight on that?
you could go either way. You know, what happens is if the tribe establishes tribal foundation we talked about today, then sometimes the library becomes a program of the foundation, and you get the benefit of that tax exempt status. So say the XYZ Foundation wants to make a grant to the library. It makes a grant to the library foundation. It makes a grant to the tribal foundation to benefit one of its programs, which is the library. So that's one pathway you could follow. The other pathway would be to go ahead and separate out and have a separate library foundation, and you can do that either through the tribe or through the state.
Okay.
Yeah,
Because
either way.
yeah, because you know, thinking about all this, and you know, my goal is to build a cultural center for our tribe, and I never realized that going nonprofit and, you know, seeking funders, private funders, you know, and charitable contributors and all that, I never really thought about, you know, how all that worked and how it all, you know, how the plan would go. I just assumed that, you know, we were nonprofit and that was it. But you know, if I'm looking, you know, down the road, say 5-10 years, I'm thinking it's probably better for the library cultural center, you know, be separate. And then, you know, like the presentation you gave today was very informative, because, you know, I don't think anybody's ever really looked at that. For example, like we have a Little League program, and they started a 501c nonprofit. That's been about a couple of years, and they had to go through the bank, and they had to do, you know, a lot of stuff. But I never realized that, you know, that would be possible under the tribe, because, you know, nobody's never informed us in the tribe and the accounting department to say, okay, this is what a nonprofit is. These are your avenues. These, you know, these are the pros. These are the cons. These are, you know, what could happen and what couldn't happen. So I really thank you for all this information, and I'm going to look more into this, and you know, I still have some presenting to do to my council and my committee, because we have the tribal council, and then we have another committee, cohort committee, just, you know, for this grant. So, and right now I'm on furlough, but I mean, that doesn't mean that, you know, I'm not committed to my job and my library and my people.
Sure.
You know, I'm still here for them, and I want them to have that cultural center, because I mean, you know, that's a place for our future, you know, to learn, to grow, to expand, and we've never had that. We have a little museum, but it's not a museum. It's very outdated. It was there, you know, at least 70, 80 years it was built, and it still has the same artifacts and items in there that when it first started. So
wow.
So thank you for the presentation. It's really informative, and I've got a lot of work to do, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, and like I say, you know, when I think about the Port Gamble Scalalum Foundation, it was reestablished to help them raise the $5 million for the Longhouse, the library, the Elder Center, and the Career and Education Center. But if you go to the Port Gamble Scalalum Foundation today, you'll see it owns and manages a botanical garden on behalf of the tribe. It has a lot of other activities that it does beyond, you know, what it did initially to raise those dollars. So if the foundation is supported, if it's given the kind of support at the outset that it be effective, it be a long-term benefit to the tribe, and that's important. There's a question about annual 990. Yeah, then that's what I was mentioning. The 990 is the report that a nonprofit and tax-exempt organization sends to the IRS. It will depend on your level of activity. It can be as simple as what's called a 990-N. 990-N is a postcard, you know, saying we are still in existence, nothing has changed in terms of our board. So it can be as simple as that. And that certainly wouldn't warrant paying an outside person to do. if you've raised a lot of money and you need to report that income as an informational report, there might be some cost of that. But one of the board members of that Washington Workforce Professionals Foundation filed the 990N just yesterday on behalf of his organization. It was a postcard upload, so it shouldn't be a big deal in that regard. Anything else that we can cover today? I know it's a lot of information all at once. And you've got the last slide that kind of gives you information about how to contact Susan. If there's follow-up questions that you need, I will go ahead and send a copy of that, how to have a lovely not-for-profit in Washington, realizing it's Washington-based, but it will give you a lot more information in terms of the steps that you could use in whatever jurisdiction you are in. And back to Lillian. Lillian, does your tribe have a business code? Does Mescalero Apache have a business code in place? Do you know?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. So
We have
typically,
a business code, a procurement code. Recently, they just added a pre-award notice ordinance where we have to notify if we're wanting to apply for a grant. We have to go through all these steps to get, to make sure that, all of our ducks are in a row, and, so they know, because in past, they all the directors in the different programs, they go out and they apply for grants and they overspent them, and their accounting's not aware, so they've put in place a business code, a procurement code, and a pre-award notice code. So yeah, we're getting there.
So if I asked in part because if you decided to go ahead with a not-for-profit, typically a tribal business code will have both a for-profit and a not-for-profit section. And the not-for-profit section would be the guide you would use to establish it. But what I'm saying is that the thing I'm going to send to Melissa will give you sample articles of incorporation language, sample bylaw language, and you can just borrow that and modify it however you choose. Make it a little bit easier.
Yeah. Why reinvent the wheel when it's already invented?
Yeah, and those of us who do this professionally do that all the time. So.
Well, I thank you for that. I think it's really important to point out that you should try to keep all of your organizing documents as simple as possible. When we founded ATOM, I was really overcomplicating things, and fortunately I had the guidance of some really good attorneys who eliminated most of my language and made it very simple, because they said that your articles of incorporation should be as simple as possible, as should your bylaws, because it's a lot easier and a lot less restrictive if you keep those documents simple. So don't try to overcomplicate things, just keep them as simple as you can to operate within the law. And also maybe check with your tribal administrators and tribal attorney and get their guidance, because there may be something already in place within your community that might be able to serve as a physical receiver for you. So just before you go through all the steps of starting your own foundation, just check to make sure those things are in place.
Yeah, we had one instance where the tribal group was looking to develop a not-for-profit. They didn't realize that the tribal foundation even existed, but it had been dormant for so long that what happened was at Port Gamble, we took a foundation that had been established in the 1980s, and we brought it back to life and used that as a basis for going forward with that $5 million campaign. So yeah, that's a good tip to kind of check it out, check out the terrain, and see what might be out there, and if it's something that's very dormant, can you use it to benefit your cultural center, museum, library, what have you. All right, well, I think we've taken the time and appreciate all your time. Thanks. Yes. Yeah.
One last question. What beach are you on in the back? It's sitting in there in the background.
That is that's the Zoom beach. That's the Zoom beach.
Okay. Is that in Hawaii?
It could well be. It could actually be in Puerto Rico, as far as I know. But it's the Zoom beach. Tim, if you don't like the beach, I can take you real quickly here to Thailand. We can go to the Temple of the Dawn.
Oh, okay.
Now you're at the Temple of the Dawn in Bangkok.
Okay. All right.
Feature.
I just giving you a
You don't
bad
want to. You don't want to see my messy house, so I put a background down.
time. Okay.
All right. All right. Well, take care, and thank you for all you do for your communities. I really appreciate you and all you do. It's you're good people doing good things. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. And I will post any extra documents that Dawn sends me on the website. I've already got this information up. If you just use your the 440 link, I'll post it again here. You'll be able to get to all of the documents. And let me know if you have any other questions, and we will see you next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dawn. That was amazing.
All right. Bye-bye now.
Bye, everyone. Have a good week.